The silence of the prairie was a special kind of quiet. It wasn't empty. It was heavy. It pressed down on you, flattened every sound until you could hear your own heart beating like a drum in a tomb. The year was 1887, and winter had stripped the land bare, leaving behind a frozen sea of mud and ice. Two little girls were walking across it. Their names were Claire and Leah Rose. They were 4 years old, twins, and for 2 days they hadn't let go of each other's hands. They were looking for their mother, Jessica Lee, a woman whose beauty the townsfolk said was wasted on the frontier, a woman whose smile had been gone for 2 long nights. Claire clutched a rag doll, its button eyes staring out into the vast, cold nothing. She whispered to it, promises the wind tried to steal. Leah Rose just limped, her foot a mess of raw blisters, her eyes already too old for her face. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. They stumbled into the edge of town, right past the saloon. Laughter spilled out like something rotten, and men in dusty coats watched them pass. They saw two starving children, alone and scared, and they looked away. They just turned their heads and looked away. The girls didn't make it much further. They collapsed in the shadow of a wagon, the world spinning into a blur. And that's when a pair of boots stopped right in front of them. The boots belonged to a man named George Colt. George was a man carved from the same silence as the prairie, rich in land and cattle, but poorer in spirit than any beggar. They called him the Silent Rancher, a man who had buried his fiancée years ago and buried his voice right along with her. He looked down at the two small girls, his shadow covering them like a blanket. Claire, with the last of her strength, held up the doll. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, mister, take my doll. Just find Mama." That simple request hit George Colt harder than a fist. He took the worn-out doll, its stuffing thin, and felt a weight in his hand he hadn't felt in years. He knelt down, his face level with theirs, and saw the same shade of desperate blue in both sets of eyes. "Where?" he asked, his voice a low gravel he rarely used. Leah Rose pointed a trembling finger toward the endless flatland. "She went that way. She didn't come back." George should have kept walking. He'd spent years building walls around his heart, training himself to ignore the needs of others. But looking at those two faces, at the doll offered up as a desperate prayer, something inside him cracked. He didn't say another word. He just lifted them onto his horse, one on each side, and rode away from the town that had already turned its back on them. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't just riding toward the empty prairie. He was riding straight into a storm that had been brewing for a very long time. The trail wasn't hard to find if you knew what to look for. George Colt knew. He saw the scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush. He saw the drops of blood, frozen like dark little jewels on the mud. He saw the footprints, shallow and dragging, the marks of someone who could barely stand. His jaw set like stone. This wasn't a woman who had wandered off. This was a woman who was running from something. He found her in a shallow ditch, curled up like a fallen leaf. Jessica Lee was still breathing, but just barely. Her dress was torn, her skin a canvas of purple and blue bruises blooming against the pale snow. She looked like she'd fought a wolf and lost. The girls scrambled off the horse before he could stop them, their cries of "Mama" shattering the cold air. Clara pushed the rag doll into her mother's limp hand, as if its button eyes could guide her back. Jessica's fingers twitched. It was the smallest movement, but to her daughters it was everything. George knelt beside her. His hands were calloused and rough from years of ranch work, but he brushed the ice from her hair with a tenderness he thought he'd forgotten. A hot, bitter shame rose in his chest. Shame for every time he had chosen silence, for every time he had walked past suffering because it wasn't his to carry. He leaned in close, his own breath trembling in the cold. "Hold on, widow," he whispered, the words a vow. "Your little ones still believe in you." He lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light, as if the cruelty she'd endured had hollowed her out. He placed her on the horse, mounted behind her, and held her close, the twins clinging to his legs. He rode hard for his cabin, a solitary shape against the horizon, a place of safety in a world that had offered none. He didn't know who had done this. He didn't know why. But as he felt the faint, ragged rhythm of her breathing against his chest, George Colt made a second vow. He would find out, and he would make them pay. The cabin was a fortress against the biting wind. George laid Jessica on his own bed, the girls huddling close, their small bodies a silent, protective wall around their mother. He stoked the fire until it roared, chasing the deathly chill from her skin. He worked through the night with a quiet intensity. He boiled water. He cleaned her wounds, his big hands surprisingly gentle. He stitched a long, deep cut on her arm with steady fingers, each stitch a tiny act of defiance against the violence that had put it there. Jessica flinched whenever he touched her, but her eyes remained closed. She wasn't flinching from him. She was flinching from the memories that were playing behind her eyelids. At dawn, her eyes finally fluttered open. They were wide with terror, then softened when she saw Claire and Leia Rose asleep beside her. George offered her a cup of water, and she drank, her body trembling. Her first words were a rasp, laced with a deep, cutting shame. "Why would a man like you touch a woman like me?" George didn't have an answer. Words had failed him for years. So he just sat back, letting the firelight flicker across his stoic face. He watched as she turned away, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Without a word, he took the heavy wool coat from his own shoulders and laid it over her. It was warm, and it smelled of cedar and horse and safety. News travels fast in a small town, especially when it's bad news. By morning, the whispers had started. At the mercantile, they said George Colt had gone soft, taking in a broken widow and her strays. They said she was trouble, that she'd drag him down into the mud with her. When George rode in for supplies, he felt their eyes on him, cold, judging. He met their stares, his back straight, his silence a shield they couldn't penetrate. But walls can't stop whispers. A boy delivering firewood brought the gossip right to the cabin door, a cruel smirk on his face as he left. That night, Jessica tried to leave. She couldn't bear the thought of ruining this quiet man who had shown her a kindness she'd forgotten existed. She made it as far as the doorway before her legs gave out. George caught her before she hit the floor. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing and carried her back to the bed. Their eyes met, and in that moment his silence wasn't empty. It was a promise. It said, "You're not going back into the dark, not while I'm here." And just like that, the cabin became their world. The days bled into weeks. The girls, Claire and Leia Rose, began to heal in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. Laughter, small and fragile at first, started to bubble up from their chests. George taught them how to scatter grain for the chickens, how to brush the thick mane of his patient old mare. Jessica healed too, but more slowly. She mended George's shirts, her stitches fine and even. One evening, as a storm raged outside, they sat by the fire. The girls were asleep on a rug at their feet. George watched Jessica braid their hair, her fingers moving with a slow, careful grace. He got up, reached for something on a high shelf, and placed it in her lap. It was the rag doll. But it was different now. The torn seams were stitched tight. The stuffing was full and firm. The button eyes, once dull, seemed to shine in the firelight. "You fixed her," Jessica whispered, her voice thick with emotion. George just nodded. Some things didn't need words. But peace, like a candle in a storm, is a fragile thing. Late one night, the sound of hooves tore through the quiet. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness outside, and loud, drunken voices slurred cruel words into the wind. It was them, the ranch hands who had left Jessica for dead. "Colt," one of them yelled, "you keeping our leftovers now? Thought you had better taste." Jessica froze, her face a mask of pure terror. The color drained from her cheeks, and she shrank into herself, the memories rushing back. But George didn't hesitate. He stood up, his body a solid shadow against the fire, and walked to the door. He didn't grab the rifle leaning against the wall. He just opened the door and stepped outside, his hands loose at his sides. The men shifted, their drunken confidence wavering under his cold, silent stare. They were used to men who shouted, who postured, who drew their guns. They didn't know what to do with a man who just stood there, his stillness more threatening than any weapon. "You think she's yours now?" Another one sneered, trying to regain his footing. "She ain't nothing but—" George took one step forward. His boots crunched on the snow, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it cut through the night like a blade. "Not anymore." It wasn't a shout, it was a statement, a fact. The men looked at each other, the whiskey courage draining out of them. They saw the certainty in his eyes, a line drawn in the snow that they did not dare cross. Muttering curses, they turned their horses and melted back into the darkness they came from. George stood there for a long time, the snow settling on his shoulders. He didn't go back inside until he felt a small, trembling hand on his arm. It was Jessica. She had watched the whole thing from the doorway, silent tears streaming down her face. "They'll come back," she whispered, her voice shaking. George looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the dark. He shook his head once. "Not if they remember." She looked up at him, and for the first time she didn't see the silent, broken rancher the town whispered about. She saw a protector, a man whose silence wasn't empty, but full of a strength she couldn't comprehend. A man who had just stood between her and the monsters. But as he closed the door, shutting out the cold, George's eyes narrowed. He had recognized one of the men. It wasn't just some random ranch hand. It was a man named Jeb, a foreman from the biggest ranch in the territory, the Blackwood Ranch. And suddenly, this wasn't just about a few drunken brutes anymore. It was about something much, much bigger, and much more dangerous. The confrontation with Jeb and his men changed everything. The quiet peace of the cabin was gone, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. George found himself watching the horizon, his hand never far from the rifle propped by the door. He knew those men weren't just acting on their own. Men like Jeb only followed orders, and the only man who gave Jeb orders was Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a cancer on the prairie, a man who bought up land, starved out smaller ranchers, and took what he wanted with a smile and a veiled threat. His ranch spread across the territory like a blight, and the town sheriff was so deep in his pocket he was practically a lint ball. George started to connect the dots. Jessica owned a small plot of land, nothing special, except for one thing. It had the only year-round spring for 10 miles. Water was life out here, and Blackwood wanted it all. George was sure of it. Beating Jessica wasn't just cruelty, it was a negotiation tactic. A way to scare her off her land for good. He started riding out, asking quiet questions. He talked to other ranchers, men who had been squeezed by Blackwood. He listened to the whispers in the saloon, his silent presence making others forget he was even there. He was gathering pieces of a puzzle, and the picture that was forming was dark and ugly. One day he found something near the ditch where Jessica had been left. Half buried in the mud was a small silver concho, the kind used to decorate a fancy saddle. It was stamped with a unique brand, a stylized bee entwined with a snake. The Blackwood brand. It was the proof he needed, but proof was useless in a town owned by the man he was trying to expose. Back at the cabin, Jessica was changing too. The fear was still there, but something else was growing alongside it. A quiet resolve. She saw the worry in George's eyes, saw how he patrolled the property at night. She knew the danger wasn't gone. It was just gathering its strength. "He wants my land," she said one evening, her voice steady. "The spring. My husband always said it was worth more than gold." George just nodded, cleaning his rifle by the firelight. "He won't stop," she continued. "Silas Blackwood never stops." George looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Neither do I." The threat came sooner than they expected. It wasn't a direct assault. It was worse. A notice was posted on the door of the mercantile, signed by the sheriff. It was an eviction order. It claimed Jessica Lee had abandoned her property and that it was now forfeit to the county, to be sold at auction. The auction was in 3 days. It was a legal, sanitized way of stealing her land. Panic seized Jessica. "It's over," she whispered, the paper trembling in her hand. "We can't fight him." "No one can." "We can," George said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Claire and Leah Rose, who were watching them with wide, frightened eyes. He saw the trust they had placed in him. He wouldn't fail it. He knew he couldn't fight Blackwood through the law. The law was bought and paid for. He had to fight him another way. He had to find something Blackwood feared more than the law. And that's when he remembered the stories. The whispers about his own fiancée, Sarah. She had died years ago in a riding accident. A tragic fall from a horse. At least, that's what everyone said, but Sarah was one of the best riders George had ever known. And her land, which bordered Blackwood's, had a rich vein of silver that was discovered just after her accident. Blackwood had bought it from her grieving family for a pittance. A cold, horrifying thought began to form in George's mind. What if Sarah's death wasn't an accident at all? He rode out to the old churchyard, the wind whipping at his coat. He stood before her weathered gravestone, the name Sarah barely visible. He had carried the guilt of her death for years, a silent, crushing weight. He'd been away on a cattle drive when it happened. He'd always told himself that if he'd been there, he could have saved her. Now he wondered if he was meant to be away. He went to the town doctor, an old man named Elias who had been there for 40 years. George sat in his office, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. "Elias," George said, breaking his usual silence, "I want to see your records, from when Sarah died." The doctor looked nervous. He wrung his hands. "George, that was a long time ago. It was a tragedy. Best to let it lie." "I'm not letting it lie," George said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, the doctor pulled out a dusty old ledger. He flipped through the pages, his finger landing on an entry. George leaned over and read the faded ink. The official cause of death was listed as a broken neck from a fall. But underneath, in shakier handwriting, the doctor had made a private note. Contusion on the back of the skull inconsistent with a simple fall. More like a blow. Sheriff refused further inquiry, mentioned Mr. Blackwood's concerns about town stability. There it was. The truth, hidden in plain sight for years. Sarah hadn't fallen. She had been murdered, and Silas Blackwood had covered it up. The grief that hit George was staggering, but it was quickly forged into something else. A cold, hard rage. This wasn't just about Jessica's land anymore. This was about Sarah. This was about a debt that was long past due. He rode back to the cabin, the doctor's note tucked safely in his pocket. He had the truth, but the truth wasn't a weapon, not yet. Blackwood and the sheriff would just deny it, destroy the evidence, and bury him right alongside Jessica. He needed more. He needed to find a way to make the whole town see what Blackwood was. When he got back to the cabin, the firewood boy was there again, dropping off a load of wood. The boy glanced at George with shifty eyes and hurried away. A moment later, Jessica came out, her face pale. "He asked questions," she said, her voice tight. "Strange questions. How many guns you have, if we planned on leaving before the auction." George's blood ran cold. The boy wasn't just delivering gossip, he was a spy. They were being watched. Blackwood wasn't just waiting for the auction, he was preparing for a fight. He knew George wouldn't give up easily. And he was getting ready to finish what he started. The night was unnaturally still. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire inside the cabin. George checked the doors and windows, barring them securely. He loaded the rifle and a shotgun, placing them within easy reach. Jessica watched him, her hands twisting in her apron. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Blackwood expects me to ride into town to confront the sheriff," George said, his voice low. "He'll be waiting for me. An ambush. He'll call it self-defense." He looked at her, at the two girls asleep by the hearth. "So I'm not going to do what he expects." He had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan. It relied on Blackwood's arrogance, on his belief that he controlled everything and everyone. "The auction is in 2 days," George said. "He thinks he's already won. He'll be in town, celebrating, making a big show of it. That's when we'll move." "Move where?" Jessica asked. "To the one place he'll never expect," George said, a grim light in his eyes. "We're going to his ranch." Jessica's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's suicide." "No," George countered. "It's the last thing he'll see coming. He'll have most of his men in town with him. The ranch will be a skeleton crew. I'm not looking for a fight. I'm looking for his ledger." Every rich man had a ledger, a book where he kept his real accounts. The land deals, the bribes, the payments. Blackwood was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He'd have a record of everything. If George could find that book, he could expose Blackwood for the thief and murderer he was, not just to the town, but to the federal marshals. It was a long shot, a crazy, desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. The next day passed in a blur of tense preparation. They packed food and water, ammunition and medical supplies into saddlebags. George studied a hand-drawn map of the Blackwood Ranch he'd sketched from memory and from the information he'd gathered. As dusk fell, a rider appeared on the ridge overlooking the cabin. He just sat there on his horse, a dark silhouette against the dying light, watching them. A clear message from Blackwood: "I see you. You have nowhere to run." That night, no one slept. George sat in a chair by the door, the shotgun across his lap. Jessica sat by the fire, holding the newly repaired rag doll, her knuckles white. Just before dawn, George stood up. "It's time." He helped Jessica and the girls mount the old mare, then swung himself onto his own horse. They slipped out the back of the cabin and into the pre-dawn gloom, moving like ghosts through the gullies and ravines, taking a long, winding path toward the belly of the beast. As the sun began to rise, they heard it, the sound of a dozen horses riding hard toward their cabin. Blackwood hadn't waited for the auction. He'd sent his men to finish the job, but they were already gone. The trap had been sprung and the cage was empty. They rode hard all day, staying off the main trails. By nightfall, they could see the lights of the Blackwood Ranch twinkling in the distance. It was a sprawling complex, more like a fortress than a home. George found a small hidden canyon a mile from the ranch house to make camp. He left Jessica and the girls there, hidden from sight. "If I'm not back by sunrise," he said, his voice heavy, "take the mare and ride north. Don't stop until you reach the next territory." Jessica grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "Don't do this, George. It's not worth it." "Sarah's life was worth it," he said softly. "Your life is worth it. Your girl's future is worth it." He gently touched her cheek. "I'll be back." He slipped away into the darkness, a shadow moving toward the lights. He crept toward the main house, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. As he'd predicted, the ranch was quiet. Most of the men were gone, likely back at his cabin, frustrated and angry. He found a window in the back of the house, in what looked like an office. He pried it open with his knife and slipped inside. The room was opulent, filled with leather-bound books and heavy oak furniture. A massive desk dominated the space. He began to search, his movements quick and silent. He checked drawers, cabinets, a floor safe hidden behind a painting. Nothing. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Time was running out. Where would a man like Blackwood hide his deepest secrets? He ran his hands along the bookshelf, feeling for a hidden latch or a false book, and then his fingers brushed against it. One of the books, a thick volume on cattle breeding, didn't feel right. It was too light. He pulled it from the shelf. It was hollowed out, and inside, tucked neatly into the space, was a small black leather ledger. He'd found it. He opened the book, his hands trembling slightly. Page after page was filled with Blackwood's precise, spidery handwriting. It was all there. Bribes to the sheriff, extortion payments from other ranchers, and a detailed entry about the purchase of Sarah's land, dated 2 days after her death, with a note about a final payment made to Jeb, the foreman. It was more than enough. It was everything. Suddenly he heard a sound, a floorboard creaking upstairs. He froze. He wasn't alone in the house. He clutched the ledger and flattened himself against the wall beside the door, pulling his pistol. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, coming down the stairs. A sliver of lamplight appeared under the door. George held his breath. The doorknob began to turn, the door swung open, and for a split second, George saw the silhouette of a man holding a lamp. But it wasn't a ranch hand. And it wasn't Silas Blackwood. It was the doctor, Elias. Before George could even process the shock, Elias let out a piercing shout. "He's in here, in the office." It was a trap. The entire thing had been a trap. Blackwood had known George would come for the records. He'd known Elias would be the key. The firewood boy hadn't been a spy. He'd been a misdirection. The real traitor was the one man George thought he could trust. Lights flared up all around the house. Shouts echoed from the yard. George hadn't found a sleeping ranch. He'd walked right into the waiting jaws of a wolf. He shoved the ledger into his coat and burst out of the office, knocking the doctor aside. He didn't have time to think, only to run. He sprinted through the house and smashed through a window on the far side, landing hard in the dirt outside. Gunshots erupted behind him, splintering the window frame. He scrambled to his feet and ran for the darkness, bullets kicking up dust around his feet. He was a fool. He'd let his grief for Sarah cloud his judgment, and he'd led them all to their deaths. He ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, the sounds of men and horses fanning out behind him. They were hunting him now, and the prairie offered nowhere to hide. The ledger in his coat felt like a block of lead, dragging him down. It was the truth. It was justice. But it was useless if he was dead. He had to get back to Jessica and the girls. He had to warn them. He stumbled through the night, his lungs burning, the hunter's calls getting closer and closer. He had made a terrible mistake, and the price for it was going to be paid in blood. He reached the canyon, gasping for breath, his side aching. "Jessica," he called out in a desperate whisper. There was no answer. A cold dread washed over him. He scrambled down into their hiding spot. The embers of their small fire were still warm, but they were gone. The mare, the supplies, Jessica and the girls, all of it vanished. He fell to his knees, the ledger dropping from his hand into the dust. He had failed. Blackwood had found them. While he was chasing ghosts in the ranch house, Blackwood's men had taken his future. Then he saw it. Scratched into the dirt was a message, shaky but clear. 4 words that changed everything. "They have the girls." And next to the words, lying in the dust, was the rag doll. Its button eyes stared up at him, a silent accusation. He hadn't been the only one who had walked into a trap. Blackwood had played him perfectly. By luring him to the ranch, he had left Jessica and the girls unprotected. It wasn't about the ledger. It was never about the ledger. It was a trade. Blackwood had taken Claire and Leah Rose, and he knew George would do anything to get them back. The rage inside George Colt burned away the despair, leaving behind a cold, terrifying clarity. This was no longer about land or revenge for a past crime. This was about saving 2 little girls who had trusted him. He picked up the ledger and the doll. He checked his pistol. He had 6 shots. He had 1 horse, and he was 1 man against an army. The odds were impossible, but the prairie had taught him a thing or two about survival. And Silas Blackwood was about to learn that you don't corner an animal unless you're ready for its teeth. He rode not toward the ranch, but toward the town. Blackwood would expect him to come charging back, blind with rage. George was going to do the opposite. He was going to bring the war to Blackwood's front door. He reached the town just as the sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of grey and pink. He rode straight to the livery stable and found the boy who had spied on him. The boy's eyes went wide with fear. "Where is he?" George's voice was quiet, but it carried the chilling promise of violence. The saloon," the boy stammered. "He's waiting for you." George nodded once. He walked out onto the dusty main street. The town was just starting to wake up, but it was eerily quiet. Windows were shuttered. Doors were closed. They knew a storm was coming. At the far end of the street, in front of the saloon, stood Silas Blackwood. He wasn't alone. Jeb and a half-dozen of his toughest men stood with him, rifles in hand. The sheriff was there too, his badge a pathetic joke on his chest. And tied to the saloon's hitching post were Claire and Leah Rose. They stood small and terrified, their faces streaked with tears. Claire was clutching Leah Rose's hand, their knuckles white. Blackwood smiled, a cruel, confident slash across his face. "Colt, I knew you wouldn't disappoint me. You have something that belongs to me," he called out, his voice echoing in the silent street. He was talking about the ledger. "And you have something that belongs to me," George called back, his voice steady. "A fair trade, then," Blackwood shouted. "The book for the children. Toss it into the street." George looked at the girls, at their terrified eyes. He looked at Blackwood, smug and certain of his victory. He knew that the moment he threw the ledger, he and the girls would be dead. The book was the only thing keeping them alive. He had to change the game. He held up the ledger in one hand. "This book tells a story, Blackwood. A story about how you murdered my fiancée, Sarah, for her land." A gasp went through the few townspeople who were peeking from behind their curtains. The sheriff shifted uneasily. Blackwood's smile tightened. "Lies and desperation," he boomed. "It's all in here." George continued, his voice rising. "The payments you made, the bribes to the sheriff to cover it up. It's all here for the whole world to see." He was playing to an audience he couldn't see, hoping the town was listening. hoping that their fear of Blackwood was less than their desire for justice. "And it tells another story," George yelled, taking a step forward, "about a woman named Jessica Lee, about how you sent your men to beat her and leave her for dead, just to steal her small piece of land." He saw a flicker of movement in a window down the street. People were listening. The wall of fear was starting to crack. "You're a murderer and a thief, Blackwood," George shouted, his voice raw. "And this town has let you bleed it dry for too long." Blackwood's face contorted with fury. The charade was over. "Kill him," he snarled at his men. But just as his men raised their rifles, a voice rang out from the side. "No." It was Jessica. She stepped out from between two buildings, a shotgun held firmly in her hands. She wasn't the broken, terrified woman from the ditch. Her eyes were burning with a fierce, protective fire. She had circled around, coming into town from the other side. Blackwood laughed. "You and what army, widow?" And then another door opened. The blacksmith stepped out, a heavy hammer in his hand. Then the mercantile owner, holding a rifle. A window slid open, and another rifle barrel appeared. One by one, the people of the town emerged from the shadows. They were scared, but they were no longer silent. George's words and Jessica's courage had given them a spine. The standoff was no longer one man against an army. It was Blackwood against his own town. Blackwood's men looked around, suddenly uncertain. They were paid to be bullies, not to fight an entire town of angry citizens. Seeing his advantage slipping, Blackwood did the one thing a coward always does. He grabbed Lyra Rose, pulling her in front of him as a shield, pressing a pistol to her head. "Get back!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "All of you, get back!" Claire let out a terrified cry. Lyra Rose stood frozen, a tear rolling down her cheek. George's heart stopped. He had pushed Blackwood too far, but in that moment of chaos, something unexpected happened. Lyra Rose, the quiet girl who had endured so much without a tear, looked up at Blackwood, and she bit him. Hard, on the hand holding the gun. Blackwood roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was all George needed. His pistol was in his hand, the shot echoing like a thunderclap down the empty street. Blackwood staggered back, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He looked down at it in disbelief before his eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed into the dust. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then Jeb, the foreman, made a move for his gun. A second shot rang out, this one from Jessica's shotgun. Jeb cried out and fell, clutching his leg. The rest of Blackwood's men threw down their guns. It was over. George ran forward, holstering his pistol as he scooped the girls into his arms, holding them so tight he thought his heart would burst. Jessica rushed to them, and the four of them clung to each other in the middle of the street, a small island in a sea of silent townspeople. The silence was finally broken by the blacksmith. "He's right," he said, his voice rough. "We let this happen." The sheriff, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quickly started arresting Blackwood's men. Justice, it turned out, could be contagious. In the days that followed, the truth in Blackwood's ledger came out, and the town was forced to look at its own reflection. The land was restored to Jessica, the corrupt sheriff was run out of town, and a new sense of community, forged in the fire of that morning, began to take root. George, Jessica, and the girls returned to the small cabin on the prairie. But it wasn't a place of hiding anymore. It was a home. The silence between George and Jessica was no longer filled with unspoken grief, but with a quiet, powerful love that had been earned through trial and terror. One evening, as the sun set, they sat on the porch. The girls were playing in the yard with the rag doll, their laughter the sweetest sound George had ever heard. Jessica leaned her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she whispered. George put his arm around her and held her close. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Some things don't need words. Their story became a quiet legend on the prairie. Not a tale of gunslingers or gold, but a story about the stubborn courage of two little girls, the fierce love of a mother, and a silent man who finally found his voice when it mattered most. It was a story that proved that even in the harshest of lands, the most broken souls can be stitched back together, stronger than before. What did you think of their journey? If you found this story of resilience and justice compelling, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.